Recently we decided to compare graphics, and a lot of games have been lauded for that over the years. What we wanted to look at couldn't take up one video. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx, the 10 best video game graphics then versus now, part 2. Number 10 is Fallout 1 versus Fallout 4. Now, yeah, I think there's some pretty obvious differences in the graphics between these two games. If you can't see them, well, I don't know what to say. At the time, Fallout was actually a really good looking game. A little bit simple, but generally it had a combination of CG rendered and hand-drawn graphics that really worked pretty well. It was isometric, not 3D at all, but a lot of the art style we know and love today was present. Now, Fallout 4 obviously looks millions of times better. It does do what it can to retain the visual look of the original Fallout, but of course it's miles ahead. That's just the nature of this kind of a thing. But that isn't to say that Fallout 4 is really astounding. It is pretty, but it is not without its problems. The original Fallout, though much more simple in its art style, does have a bit of an elegance to it that elevated it above other games of its era, whereas Fallout 4 people think it looks pretty, but nobody was like, this is the best looking game of the year. And if they were, maybe they didn't know what year it was. Number 9 is Elder Scrolls Arena versus Elder Scrolls Skyrim. Now, this is a really different comparison from Fallout 1 versus 4, in that Bethesda actually did create both of these games. I also think it weirdly enough makes the difference between these two games, though technically Elder Scrolls Arena has better graphics than Fallout Original, and technically Skyrim has worse graphics than Fallout 4. However, I can't help but think that the difference between these two games is just a bit more stark. The original Elder Scrolls Arena used a very rudimentary engine and randomly generated its terrain. That terrain wasn't astounding looking. I mean, its towns and various aspects of it were very well detailed. However, though it was in 3D, I would go ahead and say it hasn't aged as well, which is something that a lot of early 3D games did that didn't have some kind of iconic look to them. And I'd say that although it was certainly cool looking, it certainly did progress the genre. Elder Scrolls Arena wasn't that. Skyrim, on the other hand, was that. Skyrim was such a huge jump in graphics as far as the attention paid to various details in the world that even looking back on its flaws, from its bugs to its kind of wonky, sometimes areas even, the labor put into that game shows. I remember seeing the water for the first time in Skyrim and going, wow, I haven't seen anything like that before. And though looking back on it, it doesn't look nearly as good as water we see in games today, it was a really big jump, and Elder Scrolls Arena really wasn't. Number 8 is Need for Speed 1 versus Need for Speed Payback. Now, looking back on Need for Speed 1, it's actually a pretty good looking game. I remember back in the day when I first saw Need for Speed, I was like, wow, look at how good everything lines up. There's a background with a lot of detail, the steering wheel moves in a much more real looking way, and other cars were full polygons. Honestly, at the time, it was kind of shocking to look at, but if you compare it to something today, it almost looks like a bunch of cardboard. Like, not bad, but like cardboard. Like if you've made cardboard models of cars and raced them on a cardboard background that had cities printed on it. That's not an insult. I mean, nothing looked that good at that point. But nowadays, when we see Need for Speed Payback type games, Payback coming out in 2017 to be clear, we see the shine on the car, we see the dirt kicked up, we see weather, we see reflections, we see motion blur, we see stuff that, to be frank, looks nothing like cardboard. Also, Need for Speed Payback holds up. It's a couple years old at this point. Honestly, if you released it today, people would say it looked good. It's not so old that I think it's really built on fundamentally different technology, and it really looks gorgeous. It is a game that I think still currently holds a high mark in that area. Number 7 is Half-Life 1 versus Half-Life 3. Now, Half-Life 1 looks like this. You got some kind of boxy characters, but there's some impressive stuff. Certainly at the time it was amazing, and Half-Life 3 looks like this. There's nothing there. Just, nothing. There's no game. So I guess Half-Life 1 looks better. There you go. Number 6 is the original Assassin's Creed versus Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and I'm gonna go ahead and say, actually, Assassin's Creed 1 kinda holds up. I'm not gonna say that it's really that comparable to Odyssey, because Odyssey is, well, let's just go ahead and say this big, sprawling, very lived in, very detailed, interesting, beautiful world with vegetation, buildings, and rock formations that are all intricate and very believable, at least in the context of the game. And Assassin's Creed 1 is a game with fairly low resolution textures, and although it did kind of pioneer some of the gameplay that we see in open world games, it was a lot smaller in its scale at that point in time. And it's obvious, but at the same time, it has a certain style to it that I think really just works. Like, if you released a game that looked like that exactly nowadays, people would say, oh, what a cool style. Even though I don't necessarily know that it was specifically a style they were intending to do at the time, it certainly would be today, and I have to give it a lot for that, because it seems to me very easy to just sit down and get back into that game. I played it a couple years ago. It didn't feel dated to me, although it's certainly a lot different than Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and there's some stuff that's kind of questionable as far as how well it worked out. It's a great game, and it looks good. Number 5 is Grand Theft Auto 3 versus Grand Theft Auto 5. And again, we're kind of talking about what ultimately has become kind of a style. You could make a game that looks like Grand Theft Auto 3, release it in the indie scene, and people would go, all right, good job, that's really cool. And again, to some extent, it's influenced by the limitations of hardware at the time. But there is also something that's very distinctly Rockstar about Grand Theft Auto 3 and its ensuing sequels. Grand Theft Auto 5, on the other hand, just looks a lot more real. Like, the city of Los Santos in Grand Theft Auto 5 is amazing. It's shockingly well made. It's reproducing elements of a real city, Los Angeles, to such an amazing extent that I think a lot of people could easily get footage out of the Grand Theft Auto 5 engine of Los Angeles, use it in a documentary, and nobody would notice. You can get some absolutely gorgeous looking stuff out of that game. But it is a lot less stylistic. It's a little bit less identifiable as Rockstar. And I think as we move into the more realistic era of gaming, there is an element of kind of loss there. I do lament that a bit. That's not to say that Grand Theft Auto 5 doesn't look better by a landslide. It does. But there was a time when I do think that style was a little more emphasized in the Grand Theft Auto universe. Perhaps entirely out of necessity. Number 4 is Mortal Kombat 1 versus Mortal Kombat 11. Now, you may remember Mortal Kombat 1 is a game where moves were executed by basically photos of people. I think the way they did it was actually pretty cool. You can find videos of it and watch it. Most of the footage you can actually compare to in-game sprites. And it kind of yielded the ability to have fighters that were larger on screen and look more imposing because they looked real, or at least as real as they could in such a situation. Whereas nowadays, it's these big hulking CGI people, which does allow for a lot of different stuff. I think most of the moves in Mortal Kombat really work out well, being able to shift the camera around and show various things. And in that respect, I think that it obviously looks a lot better now. But the techniques on display way back, I think were pretty clever, and I think they deserve a lot of credit at this point. Number 3 is Metal Gear Solid 1 versus Metal Gear Solid 5. Now, the graphics are a massive influence over what Metal Gear Solid 1 actually is. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. The environments in Metal Gear Solid 1 are fairly linear. In some cases, they're not as linear as maybe an older 2D game, but for the most part, while they are polygonal and cool looking, there's a big limit to what is able to be on screen, and therefore the full direction of the game is more or less put on some sort of linear path. In the case of the story told in Metal Gear Solid 1, I think that works really well, and in some cases I feel like I wish that there were more games pretty much of that gameplay style today, with the on-rails camera and the stealth, and basically everything about Metal Gear Solid 1 is perfect. But Metal Gear Solid 5, on the other hand, uses graphical improvements to vastly increase what's possible with a stealth game. Pretty much every Metal Gear Solid up until that point, on some respect, followed a much more linear approach than Metal Gear Solid 5, and really I don't know that Metal Gear Solid 5 would have been possible prior to its release, at least not by many years, because it's such a specific vision and such a massive scale with much of what it's doing and the amount of detail it does it in. to even envision a game like that back with Metal Gear Solid 1 being the prevalent bit of technology that's used, I doubt it's possible. Now, the graphical level I think is intrinsically tied to the kind of game that these both are. And although detail-wise, you have to give it to Metal Gear Solid 5, it's impossible to say that it doesn't have better graphics than Metal Gear Solid 1. I think some of the limitations yielded, in my opinion, a bit better of a game in Metal Gear Solid 1. Number 2, Wolfenstein Original versus Wolfenstein 2, The New Colossus. Now, there were, of course, a couple of side-scrolling 2D Wolfenstein games. Those were made by a different developer, though, and aren't technically part of the Wolfenstein series. So, I am not talking about that. I'm kind of basically going for Wolfenstein 3D versus the most recent Wolfenstein game. So, the original Wolfenstein 3D uses visual tricks to be 3D. There actually isn't a ceiling and a floor, they're just a single color. And the walls are essentially 2D calculations displayed in 3D through a technique called ray casting. The reason this was done was because it was very processor unintensive. You could do this on a wide range of hardware reliably, quickly, with high frame rates, and that's exactly why they did it. You couldn't have stairs, you couldn't have variance in wall height, you couldn't have a lot of those types of things, but for the mazes of Wolfenstein 3D, which took place in Castle Wolfenstein, it was basically an engine that was tailor-made for the purpose. However, comparing this to New Colossus, which traverses so many different types of terrain, buildings, interiors, exteriors, etc., it's obviously no competition. New Colossus is actually, like by the standards of a current game, a gorgeous game. But we have to think about the fact that when Wolfenstein 3D came out, there was basically nothing else that looked like that. Especially nothing else that a lot of people had access to. There was Ultima Underworld, but that was actually really demanding as far as system requirements. Also, Wolfenstein is so much faster paced. That's something that's carried through to the current games, and honestly, the precedent it set made the current games possible, of course, but also pretty much invented the genre of first-person shooter. Wolfenstein 3D, the original, is just a killer game, and for the time, so are the graphics. And finally, number 1 is the original Witcher game versus Witcher 3. Now, you can see big differences in between what types of games these are just by the graphics. Cities are not constructed even vaguely similarly in these two games, and we see a lot more wilderness and exploration in Witcher 3. As such, the game has to be built around those types of assets, and those types of assets can be very hardware intensive. Cities, however, which make up a lot more of the original Witcher 1, can basically be built out of rectangles. Even basically non-standard cities, castles and the like, can be built out of shapes more so than trees and grass and all of that. I mean, obviously, a 3D tree is still polygons and therefore still reducible down to rectangles or triangles, but you use way less of them to make a wall than you do a tree. Also, Geralt looks silly in the first game. Geralt does not look silly in the third game, or even really the second game. However, for the time, Witcher 1 was actually pretty advanced. Some of its lighting effects were very impressive for the time, and it was made even more impressive by the fact it was built on the engine that ran Neverwinter Nights, the original Neverwinter Nights, BioWare's proprietary Aurora engine, which by that time BioWare had even upgraded to a completely different stage, but CD Projekt Red really pulled off some miracles with that thing, and although Witcher 3 obviously looks better, for the time, the original Witcher is actually pretty good looking. If you never look at Geralt's face, ever, doing that basically ruins it, so don't. What game series through the years have you seen that have developed intensely in the graphics field? And maybe were at the cutting edge when they first came out? Leave us a comment, let us know what you think, and if you like this video, please click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week, and the best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription. So click subscribe, and don't forget to click the notification bell. As always, thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at Falcon the Hero, and we'll see you next time, right here on gameranx.